And so instead of thinking about, the possibility of losing my mom when she had cancer, I think my mind was still just so distracted and filled with this sense of needing to be who God wanted me to be and just kind of trying to figure out what that meant.
Welcome to Voices of Deconversion. We share the inspirational stories of deconversion told by former Christians who are now atheist or agnostic. Our stories remind us we're in it together. They encourage us as we discover who we are and help us to embrace who we become. Now here's Steve with today's guest.
Welcome back for episode 60. Before I jump into the intro for today's guest, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone for being so patient in waiting for this episode to come out. I mentioned last time that we were moving and we came back from a family vacation recently, and so things haven't been as consistent as normal. But within the next month, probably by early June, we will be settled and things will be back on track. So I will do my best to get the next episode out in exactly 2 weeks. But like I said, with everything going on, it may be a little bit longer, but we'll do our best. So speaking of thanking you for your patience in waiting for this episode to come out, my guest today, some of the themes that came out in this episode, one of them was patience and the other was empathy. And I just want to say a few quick things about her and about her story. So today I spoke with Misty, and she was raised Catholic, and she was raised in the Catholic part of town. She talks about how there were kind of two parts of town. There's the Protestant side and the Catholic side, and she was raised in the Catholic part of town. And she grew up believing things like, if someone believed in God, well, that must mean that they're Catholic. At the age of 4, she contracted a virus that led to a social anxiety disorder called Selective Mutism. This has a huge impact on Misty and on her life. She had difficulty talking. She could only talk to her brother and her parents. She had difficulty talking to her sisters. And it should be noted that she was the youngest of all of her siblings, and she was born significantly later than a lot of her siblings. So she felt in some ways like she was raised as an only child. This impacted her at school. She said that she would play by herself a lot in grade school and was in her head a lot as a kid. And this kind of sparked an interest in Jesus as a figure. She develops depression as early as 11 years old. In high school, her faith deepens. She notes that her senior year of high school, she was very depressed. She notices a lot more doubts beginning. She starts thinking in terms of what God wants for her life, and she begins to feel a call to be a nun. This is really interesting to me because due to her disability and being having selective mutism and being in her head a lot as a kid, she feels like God has prepared her to take a vow of silence and to be a cloistered nun. She tells her mom over the phone that she's thinking of doing this, and this is I believe it was her freshman year of college that she tells her mom this. The next weekend, her parents drove out to visit her. Her mom was worried for Misty because her mom always felt that Misty should be a writer. And in a kind of wonderful end to this story, and a little bit of a spoiler alert, the happy ending to this story is that Misty works as a reporter for 2 newspapers, and she loves it. It was that visit from her parents where her mom convinced her to continue in school and to have fun in life. The really difficult part of Misty's story is that not long after, her mom was diagnosed with cancer and passed away. Something that was so heartbreaking to listen to was Misty describing how she wondered if God had let her mom die because her mom was an obstacle to Misty becoming a nun. How Misty came through that is amazing, and her life story is amazing. Misty's story taught her many amazing lessons. One thing was patience, and the other thing was empathy. At the end of the episode, Misty says that some people don't understand why they are the way they are, and we can't just assume we understand from an outsider's perspective. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with her, and I really loved listening back to this episode as I did the editing. Misty, you are truly very patient, and I thank you so much for waiting several months before I was able to get this episode published. It's a great story. Without any further delay, here's my interview with Misty. Misty, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's nice to be on here.
Yeah, so you had said via email, we had talked a little bit, and you'd mentioned that humanist is the best way to describe kind of where you're at. And I was wondering, what does identifying with humanism mean for you personally?
Well, I guess lately I've been thinking about how I would define myself in terms of my beliefs. And I guess I kind of am at this point where I don't know that I necessarily want to be defined according to what I believe or what I don't believe.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I feel that no matter what it is I believe, whether I believe in a God or multiple gods or no God at all, I feel that kind of the most important thing is to have that connection with other people, because I feel like in my times when I was more devoted in Christianity, I felt that if I ever felt a sort of spirituality, it was usually through my connections with people. And so even if there was evidence against God, I felt that there was still kind of a sense of, oh, maybe there could be a higher power because of my connections with other people.
So yeah, for you, it's more important to focus on just connecting with others and not emphasizing the belief or the non-belief or anywhere in between.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that's a good focus, because ultimately, like, it's funny, I ask everyone, most of my guests will say they're atheist or agnostic, and the funny thing is, like, that doesn't tell us anything about ourselves. You know what I mean? Right. Other than one question, you know? And so I like that emphasis that you kind of explain there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, tell me a bit about your background. So growing up, I know that you were Catholic. Tell me what that was like and how Catholicism influenced your upbringing.
Well, I was brought up in a very small town of about 3,400 people. And I would say, at least from my understanding, it seemed like about half of that population was Catholic. And there's even kind of a joke that the town was divided by the railroad tracks, where there was the Protestant side of town and the Catholic side of town. And the Catholic side of town was where I was raised. It was the side with the Catholic church, the Catholic cemetery, the Catholic school, K through 12, the Catholic nursing home. So there was just a lot of Catholicism right there, one little section of the town. And I guess growing up, my parents took me to church every Sunday, and even though it was something that we did every weekend, it wasn't really something that we talked about. We didn't pray as a family. I remember maybe on Thanksgiving we'd say grace before meals or something, but I felt that even just the word God wasn't really a household name in my household. Yeah, I think my first understanding of Jesus was around Christmas time. We had a manger scene that had Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus. So that was kind of my first understanding of who Jesus was. Yeah. But I don't think I really made the connection that this baby was the man on the crucifix also.
Yeah.
Until I went to Catholic school. And as a kindergartner, I remember my teacher talking to us about how Jesus was the Son of God, and that not really making sense to me because I thought that Joseph was Jesus's father. So it was something that was there, definitely, and yet it wasn't really talked about in my household.
That's interesting, and I've talked to people who it was more of a I like to say like a cultural Christian or cultural Catholicism. It's just part of life. It's not something you necessarily talk about. And I think that also has to do with the personalities of the people who are in your family. Maybe your parents weren't the type to get into these like real deep theological discussions all the time. Some people's parents are like that and they read them Bible stories or whatever. But there's just different ways to be Christian, it seems like. Yeah.
And I mean, I'd say that my mom's mom was definitely more religious. She'd go to church probably every day. I would observe her saying prayers before meals, just kind of to herself. Um,
Did you say she
but
went to church every day?
I think every day,
Wow,
almost
so very devout. Yeah, so that's your
I
grandmother out through
think,
your mom.
yeah, I'd say that the elderly community, that's pretty common, at least
Okay.
from where I'm from, for
Yeah.
the, I think especially, maybe once your spouse dies, it's kind of a community thing to get
Yeah.
a house and that sort of thing.
Stay connected with, yeah,
Yeah,
people.
right.
Yeah. And
Um,
what part of the country did you grow up in?
Minnesota.
Okay.
So
Cool. So small
around,
town in Minnesota then.
yep, yep.
Cool.
Um, and yeah, so I felt like it was definitely a normal thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I felt that, I guess, when I was coming to an understanding of God, because God had only been explained to me through the context of Catholicism, I thought that anybody who believed in God was Catholic. And like that whole idea of there being other religions or even other branches of Christianity was totally lost on me. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
really have any exposure to that. I remember there was a show I watched when I was a kid, and one of the characters was Jewish. And I guess from my understanding as a little kid, I thought that Jews were kind of like atheists, like they didn't believe in God. So there was just all this stuff in my head that wasn't really
Yeah.
quite correct.
Wasn't totally correct. Yeah, but you were
Yeah,
young. It sounds like you were a child when you were kind of forming these ideas.
right.
Yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
then how as you grew older, how did your faith mature, or your understanding of God, or your understanding of the church?
So I really got to be more interested in God when I was probably in third grade. I remember because I went to a Catholic school, the religion class discussions kind of got to be deeper during that time. I remember learning about the Ten Commandments, and for some reason, it was kind of fascinating to me to learn, oh, that, oh, God doesn't like rap music because of all the swearing in it, or we should love God above our parents, and just different things that made me think, oh, this is what I need to know for life, for
Yeah.
living. And I think I was always that kid who kind of wanted to be the good kid. I wanted to trust my parents. I didn't really like church. I thought it was really boring. I remember not really paying attention and just kind of scribbling on post-it notes because my mom let me do that for a while when I was little.
Yeah.
So it didn't really have a lot of meaning to me, but I kind of thought, well, my parents are older and they go, and I guess I just sort of assumed that I would understand it when I got older and I would continue to understand it better.
Yeah.
Um, and I think I was pretty open with learning about it. And um, so I really did enjoy religion classes, I'd say, starting in third grade.
Wow, that's pretty early to start having that interest peaked and becoming intrigued by some of the things that were talked about.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
probably just had a curious mind, and you were interested in, these interesting concepts that were kind of being thrown around.
right. And I guess I should also mention, because I think this is sort of important, I'm significantly younger than my older siblings. So my three older sisters were all in high school when I was born,
Okay.
ranging in age from, I think, 14 to 17. And my brother was 9.5 when I was born.
Okay.
So there's quite a gap, and it almost felt like I was raised as an only child in a way,
Yeah.
because by the time I was uh, 8 years old, my brother had graduated. So I was kind of on my own with my parents from that point on.
That's a very different experience than if all those
Yeah,
kids were around the same age. I guess before you, that would have been true. The 14 to 17-year-olds, they all grew up, very close probably. And
right. Yeah.
So were you basically all your siblings had moved out by the time you were, did you say around like 8 or 9 or something? Or
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. So it got to be a lot more um, lonely, I'd say.
okay.
And I guess I hadn't mentioned too another significant thing that happened to me when I was little. When I was 4 years old, I had a virus, and as a result of this virus, or maybe something else, I'm not quite sure, it's genetic. I think I developed a social anxiety disorder called
Mm.
selective mutism,
Oh wow.
and it's very rare. It's maybe only like 1% of kids develop it, and it's mainly more, from my understanding, I think it's more children who have it, and they kind of grow out of it usually.
Okay.
um, and yeah, it was a really different thing that really distinguished me as a different kind of kid.
How would that manifest itself in day-to-day life for you?
So basically, I could talk, but only under certain circumstances where I was comfortable.
And that's
So
from
it's
the
kind of,
time you were 4,
yeah, from the time I was 4.
and that
So
impacted you for how long?
like 10 years
Okay.
it
It's a
infected
very
me.
significant part of your life.
Right, yeah. So I could talk to my parents and I could talk to my brother. I think maybe because my sisters were going away to college around that time, I became less comfortable around them. And so it got to the point where I just didn't talk to them at all.
Mm.
And it was really hard for me. I had a few friends and cousins who I talked to, but I didn't talk to virtually any other adults besides my parents.
And I'm
Um,
curious about that. So was it internally, were you wanting to talk but you were incapable of it due to the anxiety, or did you just have this like I don't want to talk to anybody because of the what was happening?
it was such severe anxiety that I literally couldn't talk. I think the best description I've ever heard of it is that it's kind of like paralysis of the throat, where you just can't speak.
So even if you wanted to talk and you had the desire to talk, you weren't able to
Right, I
do it.
wasn't.
Okay. That's
Yeah,
really hard. I can't imagine like for that long too. That's such a formative time of your life.
right. Yeah, and I think it just felt more natural for me not to talk and more comfortable for me to be quiet.
Hmm.
But I did have a few cousins around my age who I talked to, and my mom always kind of described me as a total chatterbox when I was at home, and that's really how I was. I was really, it's almost like I lived a double life. Like my brother, he was in I think 10th grade when I was in kindergarten, and I'd go in his room and I'd bug him and we'd play games and stuff. But then
That's
at
cute.
school, I was just like frozen. Like I just couldn't even um, express myself in emotions really. Um, I was artistic, so I felt that that was kind of my way of expression through drawing and art projects. Um, but because this is such a rare thing, none of my teachers had ever had a student like me before.
Yeah.
Uh, my mom had never heard of this um, disorder either, but my oldest sister was a social work major when I was 4 years
Oh,
old, and she was the one who read about it in a class of hers. So she told my mom, I think Misty might have this. And,
wow.
so
That's
my mom,
really cool.
yeah, so my mom took me in, and then I got the diagnosis. And there's just not a lot of information about it. I think there is a little bit more now. Um, but at that time, it was, I think, 1996 or so. So the internet wasn't quite mainstream yet, at least not in my household.
Hmm.
So my mom had to, do research through different psychologists and things like that to figure out how to handle me. Um, and
Wow.
through the eyes of my mom, I was just a normal kid because I could still talk to her at home. Um, but yeah, so she really had to conference with my teachers and let them know what was working and what wouldn't work. And one of the biggest rules that they learned was that they could not force me to talk, because that would
Wow.
just amplify my anxiety even more.
It's just like
So,
shoving. I'm imagining it's like shoving someone on stage who has stage fright. Like
right,
just get in there. And that's not going to make it better.
right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so that was a very significant part of my childhood, especially the elementary school years. I just kind of played by myself at school. I didn't interact with kids really. Sometimes the teachers would encourage kids to go and play with me, but I didn't really want to if I couldn't talk to them. So
Yeah.
I was very much in my head a lot as a kid. And I think maybe that's kind of a big reason why I developed that interest in the Jesus figure.
Okay.
Because, in class, I was told that Jesus is kind of like a friend to the outcasts, you know. So, but I wouldn't say I was prayerful by any means when I was that age, or thinking about God too
Yeah.
much, more just thinking about normal kid things like TV shows and, concocting these different daydreams.
Yeah.
But yeah, so, but I think it definitely made me just a naturally more contemplative type of person,
Okay.
and more kind of observant too of the world around me.
Because that's how you're interacting with your world. It's not as much
Yeah.
verbal and
It's more observing than engaging.
interesting.
So,
That's so fascinating how something like that is just so random how it happens, and the way that the virus attacks your system and makes you feel that way, and then it has this huge impact on your life, and it changes the way that you interpret the world. And I mean, it's just it's amazing.
and I think they'd always tell my mom that it was genetic. So I think it maybe has a tendency to happen more if in more reserved families. I'd say that that's kind of how I describe my mom's side and my dad's side, both a lot of more reserved type people.
Okay.
So
Your family's generally that way anyway.
yeah,
Okay.
right.
And it sounds like they were quite supportive of you. I mean, it sounds like your mom put in a lot of time to try to help your teachers understand your situation, and your sister was helpful, and your brother would play with you. So it sounds like there was a lot of support.
Right.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you had mentioned that it made you more contemplative, and it made you more maybe focus more on the Jesus figure. So let's transition into that a little bit. How did what were some of the things that you discovered? I mean, you mentioned that he was like a friend to the outcast, and that's, I can see for so many people, that's such a big part of what is appealing about Jesus. So for you, was, in addition to that, what were you learning about Jesus that was helping you, or I guess what were you discovering in general?
Now that I think about it, I feel that it's kind of a stereotype of Catholics that, at least from the perspective of maybe a more evangelical type of Christian, that if you're Catholic, it's more about the religion than the relationship with Jesus. And being that it was so much integrated into my education, I think for me, it was more about the religion and the lifestyle of being Catholic, and figuring out what it meant to be a good Catholic, and what it meant to get to heaven, and what was needed to just understand the world around me. I think that was what I was really looking for, to understand the world around me. And because it was kind of communicated to us that Catholicism was the truth and the fullness of the truth, I kind of really latched onto that.
Yeah.
And I really kind of wanted to have that deep understanding of how things were
Okay.
working.
And I might be jumping ahead here, but you had mentioned that Catholicism has some particularly unique things about it that are difficult to deconstruct. So we're not maybe going to jump into all of the deconstruction quite yet, but what was leading up to that? Like, what were some of these teachings you were learning that you think are unique to Catholicism that really impacted you? Or just had an impact on you,
I guess Well, growing up, I guess I'd say some of the bigger differences are, I mean, between Catholicism and maybe other branches of Christianity is that we have the sacraments, like confession, which you probably see in the movies quite a bit,
Yeah.
where you basically confess your sins to a priest. And there's First Communion, confirmation, baptism as babies. And there's a lot of prayers that we memorize, whereas I guess I didn't get much exposure to the more evangelical Christians until college, but I felt like a very big difference was that evangelicals would kind of just say whatever was on their hearts when they were praying. But for Catholics, it was more like we memorized prayers.
Yeah.
And being that I had selective mutism, when we'd get tested on those prayers, I had to write them down when everybody else would just have to say them audibly to the teacher or verbally to the teacher.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah. I'd say it's a lot more ritualistic, more very ingrained in tradition. And as I got older, I felt that there was just way more emphasis on suffering. To me, it was kind of always explained that church wasn't a place to go to be entertained. It was more like an obligation, something you did every Sunday. And it was kind of a Catholic belief that you had to go every Sunday. And if you didn't go every Sunday, then you were in a state of mortal sin. And that meant that you would go to hell, basically.
If you missed 1 week?
If you missed 1 week. So if
I
you...
think I've heard that before. That's
Yeah.
So, what a burden to have on your mind,
Right.
If you're thinking,
Well,
and now as a kid, I know
it
you
was
probably wouldn't think of it too much, but
Yeah,
as you
I
grow
guess
older,
growing up, it was always just normal that we'd go every Sunday, even if we were on vacation.
Yeah.
So it was kind of never a question to do it. It was like brushing your teeth. You did it.
I kind of see the value in, I grew up more evangelical, but I see the value in having these things like, hey, this is an important tradition, and it may not be fun, it's not here to entertain you. This is what you need to do. It's an obligation, I can see the value in that, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess it was never something that I questioned much at all. It was in the context of my life. It was normal. All my friends were in it. Some of my friends definitely had parents who seemed to talk about it to them more. And I think I actually kind of had a jealousy with that, because I felt like I kind of wanted my parents to talk about it more with me, but it just felt like something that would be uncomfortable to bring up in conversation.
Okay.
Even though, I mean, if I had an assignment about it, I'd probably bring it up, but otherwise it wasn't ever talked about.
Just wasn't a comfortable subject for your family.
Right.
Yeah. Well, something you said was that the stereotype of Catholics from an evangelical perspective is that it's not as much about a personal relationship with God and things like that. Was there an element of that at all for you?
I think as I got older, definitely
becomes more personal as you grow up.
Yeah, it was more of a gradual thing, I guess. I'd say, well, I guess first it might be important to note that I think with the selective mutism, I also developed depression from a young age. I'd say in retrospect, I was probably 11 when I experienced my first bouts of depression, but I didn't know what that was. And that was just kind of another thing that wasn't maybe talked about enough in my school.
Wow, and if you're a quiet kid, not just because you're quiet in general or because of this virus, but in addition to the depression, like they're not going to notice that probably as easily.
Right, yeah. So, exactly, it was kind of just expected for me to be quiet. But I think I just had so much going on in my brain because of all that quiet. And I didn't have the words to communicate it, nor did I have the ability to communicate it. So there was definitely that feeling of being trapped.
Wow.
Um,
How
and
long did you feel that way? How many years did this go on before you recognized and addressed it?
the depression, I'd say I didn't actually address until my 20s,
Yeah,
actually.
I'm not associated. I'm not saying that my experience was yours, but I also didn't recognize depression until many years later. Yeah, it's crazy how you can't see
Uh,
it, you know,
yeah,
sometimes.
I think we did have speakers about depression, but I always thought, well, that's not me.
Yeah.
I guess I'd think about more extreme cases, and I always felt I'm not going to become suicidal. So as long as I'm not there, I don't feel like I need to address it, was kind
Yeah.
of how I thought about it.
Interesting.
Um, but I think that definitely started to get worse throughout my high school years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think I did start to journal a lot, and that was really helpful. Um, and I think what I was always just kind of looking for was how to find peace of mind. Um, Even after I grew out of the selective mutism, and started talking to everybody, and um, like eventually throughout the years, I had started to talk to more people from my school. I developed more friendships, and those were really helpful. And um, I think a lot of times, there was a lot of gratitude for those friends who had been there for me
I
um,
bet.
during those periods in my life. Even when I couldn't talk to them, they were still really good friends to me.
Wow.
Um, but I eventually did grow comfortable with enough people, and it was definitely not an overnight transformation by any means. It was very gradual, and yeah, I ended up talking. The first day of my freshman year of high school was when I started talking that year. But I felt that the even though I overcame that obstacle, I felt like the bigger obstacle was still the depression that I was internalizing and didn't know how to deal with. I ended up having a lot of thoughts, um, just kind of about God, um, and not really knowing where to go with those thoughts. Um, just kind of like questions, I guess,
In
that,
in high school.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I felt like I always wanted to find peace of mind, and I always kind of assumed that that peace of mind would come from knowing and understanding God and deepening my faith in some way because
Hmm.
of how I was raised. Um, so I guess my first bout of getting to be really religious came when a friend of mine invited me to kind of like a retreat um, in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I wasn't really sure what to expect with that, but it was very charismatic. So that was my
Oh.
first experience with
Probably
charismatic worship.
freaked you out.
It was really uncomfortable at first because I was not expecting that. I thought it was going to be more like church, but it was like an auditorium full of kids who were like clapping their hands and throwing their hands in the air and singing to music on a screen. And at first, I was just really uncomfortable. I kept thinking, I just want to go listen to the Goo Goo Dolls. Like, this is just weird.
That's
Um,
funny.
but my two friends who came with me um, were really into it. Like, they got kind of overcome with this. They both kind of started crying at certain points during it. And to me, it was kind of like, I'm not feeling the need to cry. Like, is there something wrong with me? Like, why am I not overcome with emotion right now. And then, I don't know, this was probably like a 3-day retreat. We stayed in college dorms, and I think I enjoyed it because it gave me an opportunity to meet new people, and being from a small town, that didn't happen very often.
Yeah.
And I think for me, just any opportunity to become more sociable was something I saw as a good thing, because that had been such a struggle for me for so long. But I think the biggest takeaway I had at that retreat was something one of the speakers said about a formula for finding joy would be putting Jesus first, others second, and yourself last.
Wow.
So JOY, Jesus, others, yourself. And so a light bulb kind of went on for me there. And I thought, okay, that's what I want to start doing. So I tried to kind of just maintain that mentality of putting Jesus first. And I guess I should explain that for me, that didn't necessarily mean reading the Bible. I feel like that's kind of another Catholic stereotype where we don't read the Bible all the time, whereas maybe more Protestants or evangelicals are more devout in reading the Bible. I guess for me, that just kind of meant thinking about a higher power and thinking about others, and then just kind of not putting myself as a high priority. And at the time, I felt like that was
just real quick. That makes me sad, because I've heard so many ex-Christians say things like the Bible and Christianity taught them to like not value themselves as much. You know what I mean? Like, it sounds really noble and selfless. Like, oh yeah, put others first. I mean, putting others first is good, but I think sometimes it can end up being a bad thing. But sorry, I interrupted what you're saying.
No, I definitely agree with that. And I think at the time I felt like it was helping me for maybe like a year.
It gave you something to focus on and focus your kind of devotion to God.
Yeah, I think I just tried to, I guess maybe when you're a teenager, you're kind of self-absorbed just in a natural way. So I think it was kind of a comfort to me to just try to think about other people and think about, the things that were outside of me, to kind of take the focus off of my problems. But I think in retrospect, I see that was kind of not a good thing for me, especially having had depression. And I think it definitely pushed back. If I had any notion that I needed to get help, I don't think that was helpful in that direction.
Yeah, because then you're not focused on trying to, as they say nowadays, self-care, getting mental health addressed, getting those issues addressed. Yeah, I can see how that would be damaging, and to not be thinking about yourself in those terms, but to only be focusing on pleasing God and pleasing others.
Right. And I think I don't remember if it was my junior or my senior year, but I remember a particularly damaging homily or a sermon at church. And the priest was basically communicating the message that God doesn't care about our happiness, was kind of the message of his sermon.
Wow.
Basically what he was saying, that God cares about how close we are to him, whether or not that means that we're happy or not. And I think to me, that was kind of validation that I was doing something right. Because I wasn't happy. And
oh wow, I can see why you said that was damaging.
Yeah, so I felt that. So I remember sitting in the pew and just kind of silently agreeing with him and thinking, yeah, of course, it doesn't matter if I'm happy or not. It matters more that I'm following God. So
wow.
Yeah.
And that was also in high school?
Yeah, that was in high school.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely that element that happiness wasn't as important as holiness.
That struck me when you said that as such an odd sermon for a pastor or for a priest to give. Like,
Right.
I've generally, you hear those things together, like a relationship with God will bring you ultimate happiness, like, rather than, like, I just, like, the thought occurred to me, like, was this priest himself, like, really unhappy and just thought, like, nope, I gotta do it, I gotta have a closeness with God or something. Like, it's weird. It's a weird sermon in some ways, but I do understand.
He was very strict, and I think a lot of people had issues with him because he had some very hard-hitting sermons. I think he's still at that church.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's and actually when I moved back to my hometown after graduating from high or college, he was still the priest at that church, and I eventually had to find a different church because I recognized finally that it was kind of damaging to my mental health to just try to stomach some of these things he was saying.
Yeah. Well,
So,
how did things progress for you religiously, but also just personally with all the things you were working through from that time that you heard that sermon about God doesn't care if you're happy, he just wants you to be close to him. After you'd heard that sermon, kind of that time in your life, how did things progress for you then after that?
um, I guess at the time I didn't feel that this was a life-changing sermon. It was more years later I looked back to that and pinpointed it as a damaging
Yeah.
thing that put me or just kind of validated what I thought about myself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I'd say my senior year of high school was really difficult. I remember just being really depressed, and I journaled, and I think I kind of just tried to focus on schoolwork and um, oh, actually, I should mention something else that I remembered.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I hadn't really had any exposure to atheists until my junior year of high school.
Okay.
Um, I met a cousin of mine, an older cousin, for the first time that I could remember since I was a little girl, at one of my aunt's funerals. And he lived in St. Louis, so I didn't grow up really knowing him very well at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I really knew nothing about him, actually. I knew his mom because she'd come and visit us, but she never brought her sons with her.
Okay.
Um, so he was probably 15, 16 years older than me. And because all my other relatives were so used to me being quiet, they didn't really talk to me very much at family events. But this cousin, because he basically missed out on all of those years of selective mutism, he just struck up a very simple conversation with me at this family gathering just about school. And he was asking me questions, and he was very friendly in a way that some of my other relatives just didn't exhibit to me. And I just remember after that, I just thought, wow, he was so nice to me. Like, I'm really glad I was able to connect with this cousin I didn't know very well.
Yeah.
And around that time, Facebook was getting bigger. So we added each other on Facebook. And then I saw on his profile that under his religious beliefs, it said he was an atheist. And I was just shocked. Like, my heart just broke because I thought, how is that possible? He was so nice.
Yeah.
I just,
Yeah.
From my experience, I had always painted atheists as being just lost and broken, angry, mean. Yeah. And so I couldn't put that together in my head. But I think I was also the type who was just very curious about other people and how people functioned, in their minds, and how they came to their conclusions and beliefs and things. So sometimes we would have just these kind of silly on quick online chat conversations, not about anything super deep or personal at all. But then one day I decided to ask him when he stopped believing in God, because I had assumed that I knew he went to a Catholic school too, so I thought he had to have believed at one point or
At some
another.
point. Mm-hmm.
And he told me that he had never believed, and that was like really shocking to me. So then we kind of got into, I don't know if I wouldn't call it an argument because we weren't really being mean or anything, but we were just,
But like a constructive argument.
yeah, kind of a
Yeah.
constructive conversation. And he was definitely challenging some of the things that I believed. And I wasn't expecting him to be as knowledgeable as he was about the Bible, and about just kind of the history of the church. And he sent me, I think, some videos on YouTube that really brought me into question of whether or not Jesus was God. But I do remember it was a complicated time because I felt like I had this connection with him that I didn't have with any of my siblings,
Mm-hmm.
or even with my parents. Like, I never really talked to my parents about these things, and so I felt like I had developed like a really strong connection with him, but yet we were on opposite sides, and he was kind of starting to get me thinking more and questioning things and coming into doubt, and that felt really lonely in the context of where I was living.
Oh, wow.
And
Were you at home at that
yeah.
point? Okay. And so you said it was difficult in the sense that, like, he's challenging these ideas that you've held on to and you can't talk to anyone about it? Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah, I think I talked to my friends about it, but I didn't really feel like anybody around me had the answers I was looking for. And I guess I kind of felt like I was alone in it. I didn't really feel comfortable talking to any of my teachers about what I was going through.
I'm going to ask you why. I have ideas on this because I had similar feelings, but why weren't you comfortable talking to the people in your life about what you were hearing from him?
I think part of it, when I had selective mutism, I think I learned to just figure things out for myself. And I kind of developed that habit of just not asking questions. And
So that's your gut reaction is, okay, or your knee-jerk reaction is, okay, I need to just process this myself. I'm going to kind of, you're not thinking this probably, but you're just doing it. You're just
right.
internally processing it.
I think I did maybe ask a priest a couple questions, like during confession, about some of the things he had told me. I don't know, maybe it was just kind of being a teenager as well, where I was kind of embarrassed about it too, like that I was kind of having this debate even. Just being kind of more private too.
Yeah, I that makes sense. I was thinking, like, for me, there was just no one who was in a similar place that I felt safe to talk to. Like, you can't, like, you're hearing from this atheist cousin, you can't go talk to other atheists because they're going to try to, they're going to tell you the same thing. So you want to get perspective. So you want to talk to, like, other people who are maybe moderate Catholics or something who wouldn't just shoot down his ideas, but would talk it out with you. And I think those kinds of people are, like, impossible to find. You know, it's hard to find people who will reasonably like say, oh, I can see where he's coming from, but this is what that's kind of along the lines of where my mind was going with that. But I didn't even think about how kind of your history would, just the habit for you was just to start processing these things yourself.
Looking back, I don't really feel that there was anybody in my life in high school who I really felt comfortable confiding in. I didn't feel that sense of comfort with my parents or with any of my siblings. The teachers, I was always afraid would talk about me to other teachers, or even to some of the underclassmen. because I knew that one of my teachers, after I had overcome my selective mutism, I knew from a younger cousin that she had talked about that with one of her classes,
Oh,
and
wow.
it
That's
kind of
not.
pegged me as a miracle, and that really made me uncomfortable.
Yeah, that seems really unprofessional of her to do
Right.
that. Because she
Yeah.
named you. She didn't just say, like, I know of someone who this or that. She, like, named you.
Right. Yeah. And she had been somebody who really helped me through the selective mutism, so she had kind of taken it that she had helped out with this miracle, and that
I see.
really made me uncomfortable as well. Um,
Yeah.
so I felt like she had kind of lost my trust in that sense. Um, and I just didn't feel like there were any other teachers who I felt safe to openly confide in
Yeah.
about personal matters.
So what did you do then as you were processing these things he was saying and you were internally kind of wrestling with them?
I did a lot of journaling. That was always the way I processed things. I just felt like it was a lot easier for me to gather my thoughts by writing than by speaking. Um, and so when I would kind of try to come up with arguments, I would kind of journal about it first before I would send him my response. Um,
That's cool.
and I think we kind of just got to a point where I realized that we were kind of speaking in circles and we weren't going to get anywhere. And I just kind of got burnt out by it. So I was the one who sort of put a stop to it and said, why don't we just go back to talking normally now?
Just normal stuff, yeah.
Yeah.
And was he receptive to that?
Yeah,
That's nice.
he was respectful of that. And I remember him even saying that I fought a pretty good onslaught, but he was still, of course, an atheist. And at the beginning, I kind of thought, maybe I can convert him. Like I was kind of excited about it, thinking I had all this information that he didn't have, but I was very wrong.
But
So
I think that do you look back fondly on those interactions with him?
I do now. And I've even thanked him recently, just for giving me that exposure because I think I really needed that. Um, even when I was still a believer in my religion, I thought that it was good for me to have those interactions to kind of come to a better understanding of why people don't believe and what they're like, that
Yeah.
I realized that I had a lot of misconceptions about atheists.
That's a great
So,
that's a great perspective because you're understanding others better, people who are different from you better, and that's always a win-win in my book.
right, yeah. But yeah, after that, I think I did become a lot more doubtful about God after that. And I think that was when I started to get more depressed. Um, and it was probably for other reasons too. It was my senior year. I knew where I was going to college, but there was just a lot of wanting to get away and having a hard time being present in my day-to-day life. I just wanted to go to college. I wanted to get out of my small town. I wanted to have exposure to other people and go somewhere where people didn't know about me having had selective mutism.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to just start over and become who I wanted to be. So I think when I was 18, I found a book by the author Marianne Williamson.
Okay.
You're familiar with her?
I'm not.
She's kind of like an inspirational speaker. She actually recently announced that she's running for president in 2020.
Oh, wow.
But I knew one of her quotes that said, "Our greatest fear is not that we are inadequate, but that we can shine beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us."
Interesting.
And so when I saw her name on a book at Barnes and Noble, when I was a senior in high school, I picked it up and started reading it. And she started out this book talking about the darkness and kind of describing her own depression. And it resonated with me so much because I felt like somebody was finally describing how I was feeling. And I read on further, and the way she writes is not necessarily it's not a Christian book, but it was kind of a different take on God than the Christian perspective, and more, I think, more focused on the human being than on a higher power. And it was more describing love and fear as opposites. And that was something that really stuck with me. She's basically teaching that any decision you make, you're either making out of love or out of fear. And and that was something that I think really stuck with me, because after that, I became more perceptive to all the times that I was acting out of fear. And it made me realize how scared I was of love, and and how scared I was to even just like have strong connections with my parents or my siblings. And now that I look back, I feel like I even used the religion as a way of hiding behind that, because I was allowed to focus on God above other people. And so it's almost like I was focusing too much on this higher power to the point where it disconnected me from the people around me.
Interesting.
And I was just so in my head all the time. And, that came from the many years of being quiet and being just in that social disconnectedness. But I felt...
Go ahead.
So I felt like, the religion forbid me from doing so many things. And for me, that was kind of my defense mechanism in a way, that kind of kept me locked in instead of exploring the world around me.
Yeah, piety was a way to keep people at arm's length.
Right, yeah.
Now, what were you fearing? Do you know, like, when you think about those relationships with family or friends or anyone, the ones that you were kind of creating distance between? You said fear. There was some fear there. What were you afraid of in getting closer to those people in your life?
I think I just really had a lot of fear of vulnerability. I had a fear of exposing myself and my feelings. I had a fear of getting close to people because I think I had a fear of abandonment. I'm not really even sure where that came from. It's things that to this day I'm not really sure where all that fear was coming from.
It's just human things that... Yeah, we all struggle with these things on different degrees, I think.
Right. Yeah, so I really kind of latched on to the teachings of this Marianne Williamson. She got it from a book called A Course in Miracles, that I guess she would define a miracle more as a shift in perception from fear to love versus something radical like, animals talking or something out of the ordinary.
This is like really deep stuff, like very philosophical perspective that she has on like miracles being a change in perception, and not like literally like some amazing miracle that happened, but actually like the way you perceive it, kind of a life-changing event.
Right.
Maybe.
So I feel like that book in a way just really changed my life, and I remember even just noticing myself having just a better perspective of life after reading it. And I think I was always such a philosophical, analytical sort of person, and this just seemed like it was more personal than Bible stories. It was more like getting into my mind and helping me kind of figure out my just kind of get my shit together,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, that's great. I mean, those moments, those books, those types of people are so wonderful when you look back at your life and say like, wow, that was such a huge turning point for me, and this person really was a big part of it.
Right, yeah. Um, and I liked it too because it wasn't a religion. It's not like there's an organization surrounding this thought process. It's just um, really practical self-help kind of
Yeah.
things. So, um, but I think after that, um, I kind of tried to apply this way of thinking that she had talked about. Um, and I'm not really sure how to describe where I was at with God at that point, but I do know that when I went to college, um, it was a really difficult transition for me at first, having moved away from home for the first time. And I went to a college where none of my friends were.
Oh, really?
It was
Okay.
four hours away from home.
Okay.
I realized pretty quickly that I didn't like my major.
Mm.
Um, and I had kind of thought that I would just latch on to the other Catholics who were on campus. Um, I think on Catholic campuses, they usually have something called the Newman Center, which is kind of like a church on campus for college students.
Okay.
But this one was closed on my campus. So I ended up going to, maybe you're familiar with Chi Alpha.
Yeah, is it like a sorority or fraternity or something, or?
No, no, it's affiliated with Assemblies of God Church.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so this was a church organization, sort of,
Okay.
where we do charismatic worship on campus. And I ended up meeting a lot of my friends that way, the ones who I really felt comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
And
It was a religious school that you were going to?
no, it was a liberal arts college.
Okay. So it's a secular college, but
Yep.
it has this, like many colleges do. It has,
Yeah.
affiliated things like this that, are religious,
Right. Yeah.
or groups that form, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
So
this is kind of where you were going for kind of the connection with people who were like-minded and
yeah, it was um, definitely where I got my social interaction, and I latched on pretty quickly to these friends. They had game nights. They'd go out to eat after worship services. Um, I got to be really good friends with two girls in particular, and they became my college roommates the next year. Um, and it was refreshing to me, I think, because it was so different than Catholicism. It wasn't so ritualistic. It wasn't so focused on suffering. I felt it was just more. I felt like all the hipsters were a part of it on campus. It just seemed cooler, I
it was
guess,
the
than
yeah.
um, than the more tight-laced religious people I'd grown up with.
Yeah.
So at first I thought it was really refreshing, and I think even just meeting people who had different backgrounds than me was really fascinating. I had never understood or even heard of the concept of being saved until I joined a Bible study through this Chi Alpha, and people took turns sharing their testimonies, talking about how they got saved.
Mm-hmm.
And I had never known that was a thing.
That's so
I thought
funny.
everybody was just baptized as babies,
Yeah.
or maybe came to find it later in life as adults. But yeah, so I had a lot of conversations with these girls, just kind of trying to figure out where I stood, what I believed. I then got to be just kind of confused, I think, because I had always thought that Catholics had, quote unquote, the fullness of the truth, and yet here were these really devoted Protestant Christians who were very knowledgeable about the Bible in ways that I wasn't. Just very kind and reaching out, evangelizing more. So I really started to get confused about what I believed was right or what was wrong in terms of what to believe as a Christian.
Yeah.
So that was a confusing time. And then I guess what happened was I got involved, in addition to the Chi Alpha Bible study, I got involved in a Catholic Bible study through a friend I met in one of my classes. And then over Christmas break, I ended up going to a Catholic conference. And during that conference, we had confession. And so when we'd go to confession, we'd get like an examination of conscience book where it would list all the 10 commandments and all the possible sins that you could commit under those commandments.
Oh my gosh, that's funny.
Yeah, so that would kind of help you know what you were going to say once you got into the confession booth.
Like, oh yeah, these 3 apply to me. Okay, great. I've got my 3 sins I'll go tell them about.
Right, yeah.
That's really funny.
Yeah, it's weird when I look back on it.
Right, yeah.
But I remember reading in this book that it was considered a sin for a Catholic to go to a non-Catholic worship service. And so obviously I'd been going to Chi Alpha and I'd been enjoying it. And so I had questions about that. So when I went to the priest for confession, I told him that I'd been going to non-Catholic worship ceremonies. And he was just kind of condescending to me. Like, he was just like, well, why would you need to go to that if the Catholic Church has everything that you could ever need or want? And so after that, I just felt like a lot of guilt.
Yeah.
And I felt like, okay, yeah, I guess that's true. I mean, I don't necessarily believe in the way that these Protestants believe, so maybe I should stop going. Maybe I need to become more serious about Catholicism again. And so things kind of went downhill from there.
Before you jump into that, I just have to say, and I don't mean to be like, mean to Christians or Catholics, but I'm just referring to all of them as Christian, but just Christians can be so like elitist about their version of Christianity.
Yeah.
And I'm finding that Catholics were that way. I didn't know, I've learned about Catholics and their experiences as I've done this podcast, but certainly many different types of Protestants are. The fundamentalists are very elitist about their, I don't know if elitist is the best term, but anyway, they're very like, oh, we understand it. We believe the truth of the Bible literally. And then you've got the moderate mainline denominations of Protestantism that are like, well, we're not fundamentalists, and they look down on fundamentalists. And it's just everyone looks down their nose at each other in Christianity. Yeah. I mean, it's probably a human thing, but still, it's so irritating. And like, here you are, just a college kid, like, just kind of learning about religion and learning what you believe. And then this priest is like super condescending.
Yeah, just trying out something new meeting new people. And it had been a positive experience for me. Except for the times where I felt like the Protestants were kind of looking down at me for being Catholic.
Right.
So I just felt kind of frustration towards both social circles because I felt like they were both just missing what the other side was saying.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Here I was just kind of in the middle of it and not quite sure who I agreed with and who I didn't.
Yeah.
But anyway.
So all went downhill from there, you said.
Yeah, so, okay, I guess I need to back up more. So another thing about Catholicism is that there's a lot of emphasis on vocations, like a vocation to the religious life, which would be your nuns, your sisters, priests, deacons, monks, that sort of thing. And, I remember in high school, there would be posters on the wall sometimes that would say, "Have you thought about your vocation today?" I remember one in particular of a downhill skier, and it said on the bottom, "Now she's a nun." And,
Oh my
you know,
gosh.
like they'd have
That's so
speakers come
funny.
in and talk about their vocations. And I remember as high school seniors, my class of about 40 students, we went to a retreat center where we met these women who are in the process of becoming religious sisters. Um, and they were all sharing their stories with us about how they had thought that they wanted to be married and have children, but then God had other plans for them. And I remember talking to one who wanted to be a screenwriter, and then she ended up writing a screenplay at college about nuns, going to interview them, and deciding that she wanted that, or that God had been calling her to that lifestyle instead. And to me, that just made my heart race because I had been wanting to be a screenwriter, and I was like scared
Oh.
that maybe God had put that woman in my life to help me make the decision sooner.
Yeah.
Um, and that whole concept of doing what God wants, not what I want, that had never been something I thought about until that retreat as a
Hmm.
senior. Um, and
That
it
becomes
kind of
very
shook my
confusing.
world. Yeah,
It's
it was really confusing because I'd always wanted to be a writer, and that was never a question for me. And then, but I guess I had never asked myself, is this what God wants? It was just always, this is what I'm good at, this is what I enjoy.
oh man, that's so frustrating because it just muddies the
Yeah,
water.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was just so, yeah, after meeting these women who were talking about how, like me, they had wanted to be married and have kids, but they realized that God wanted them to give their lives in a different way, and they were talking about this with, such joy in their voices, and that was just really bizarre to me.
Hmm.
um, and also being kind of depressed, I kind of got to thinking, what if they have what I'm missing? So,
Because
um,
they acted so joyful about it.
right. So that was kind of an idea that was somewhat planted in my head as a senior, and then I guess I kind of just brushed it aside and continued preparing for college, without really thinking about it that much. Although I do remember my high school priest whispering in my ear at my graduation party, "I think you would make a good sister,
Oh my
a good
gosh.
nun," and which I think was just totally uncalled for. But yeah, anyway, I switched my major. I had been a film major and I switched to English after one semester at college. Um, and then January of my senior year, I feel like I just I don't know if I would describe it as kind of a mid-year crisis. But after going to a Catholic Bible study where they were talking about nuns, nuns are cloistered and they take vows of chastity, obedience, and silence. So basically, they're kind of just cut off from the world,
Wow.
serving God in prayer like 8 hours a day, give up all their possessions.
Oh.
They don't really go into society unless it's for doctor's appointments and things of that nature. Um, and yeah, I remember some girls in the Bible study kind of saying, "Yeah, that's just so weird. Like, I can't imagine doing that." And then the Bible study leader just kind of said, "Well, they're very important for holding up the Catholic Church with all their prayers." Um, and I don't know if it was just so much exposure to Christianity that whole year, I think was just a lot of throwing myself into this. And one morning I just woke up and I called my mom and I told her that I felt a calling to be a nun.
Oh, wow.
And I was serious about it. I really felt like I don't know how I can. And I was really confused, not really knowing how to explain my reasoning to her. And I think once I calmed down and thought about it some more, I realized, you know, I'd always been looking for something to justify why I had selective mutism, why I couldn't talk all those years. And that day, I really had this inkling, what if God gave me selective mutism as a way of preparing for taking this vow of silence
Oh, wow.
for the rest of my life?
It's fitting a narrative.
Yeah, I just thought, who better to do this than me? Because I'm already used to being quiet and cutting myself off socially.
Wow.
And I just felt like I could do it and that the church needed me in that way.
And how long ago was this?
It was probably like 8 years ago now.
Okay, so it's been some time, but
yeah.
Still, okay.
Yeah, I was 19 and my mom was just like so scared for me. She was like, what is going on with you? Are they brainwashing you there? Like,
oh, wow. So she did not like the idea of you becoming a nun.
No, she thought that there was definitely something else going on with me, like a mental health situation or something. She just felt like,
Yeah.
She said, I always thought you'd be a famous writer. I never understood that lifestyle of being a nun.
It's so funny that they raise you very religious, and then when you go too far, it scares them.
Yeah, and and my mom and dad even drove all the way to my college town the next weekend to visit me because she was just really concerned about me. And my brother actually had thought about being a priest when he was in high school, but I think he just had a lot of pressure from my grandma, and he ended up leaving the church when I was in junior high or high school. And my mom even wanted me to talk to him because he had become a counselor, and she thought that maybe he would have some advice for me. So I do remember him kind of calming me down and just saying, I used to be religious too, but it took me some time to actually figure out what I believed until maybe my later 20s. So, and I just kind of had a hard time taking him seriously because he had left the church.
Okay,
so,
yeah, so you felt like maybe he wasn't as devoted as you felt you were.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Now, I got a little confused at one point because you said you were about 18 years old when this was happening, but you also said I thought you were like a senior in college.
No, I was a senior in high school when I went on that retreat.
Okay.
Where I had met those sisters in progress who were talking about their experiences, and then it was my freshman year.
Okay.
Yeah, my freshman year of college
that you wanted to be a nun.
Yeah.
Okay. And did you change majors because of the decision to want to be a nun, or was that unrelated?
No, that was unrelated.
Okay.
I actually switched my majors before that whole phone call to my mom, but I was kind of not totally confident. I didn't really see how it connected to God, and I just was so in that mindset that everything I did had to have some sort of connection to serving God.
Yeah.
And I guess I just thought that I needed to do the most extreme thing that there was to do. But my mom was really worried about me at that point.
Okay.
And I was frustrated with her for not being more supportive. but she did convince me to just continue going on with school, and she really just wanted me to have fun was kind of her
Yeah.
overall message to me.
Live life. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and I think I just took life so seriously that I couldn't see myself just having fun in the way other college students maybe did at
Yeah,
that
and
time.
I think there's this like balance, or there's this contrast of a young person who's trying to mature and take life seriously versus an adult parent who has done that and is doing that, probably because as you get older, life gets more serious and in some ways. And that parent's looking back and saying, man, like those college years, those are the years to really explore and have fun and like learn who you are. But yet that college student that you were was trying to take life seriously and was trying to kind of go in a different direction in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also my best friend from growing up, um, we had been friends since we were 4 years old, and she was probably more religious than I was when we were kids, and then kind of went through a more rebellious stint in high school. And then in college, we were just polar opposites. She got to be, just kind of more into partying, drinking in college, but I was definitely more into going to church.
Yeah.
And so I think I just developed this sense of worry about her too. There were other people in my life who I felt like I needed to save. I had a sister who had never gone to church, another sister who was kind of in and out. So I guess I just felt like speaking was always hard for me, and evangelizing, I'd always just kind of choke up. I didn't really feel comfortable telling people how to live their lives.
Yeah.
But personally, I had felt really strongly about how people should be living their lives. And I just thought, being a nun, that's my way of making a really big sacrifice
Mm-hmm.
and kind of being away from society.
Yeah. So, did you pursue that any further then, becoming a nun?
I didn't, because I felt like I do remember messaging a sister who I had on Facebook about it, telling her that I was considering that as a vocation. She kind of encouraged me to consider whether or not Jesus was somebody I wanted to date, because that's essentially kind of what you are. You're a bride of Christ when you make that commitment.
Yeah.
And that just kind of felt weird to me.
Yeah, it should have.
Yeah, and
That's so weird.
I guess I just felt like I just need to maybe just take things one day at a time, maybe finish college and then consider it. So I decided to do that.
That's really
And
good. It's fortunate.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm really glad that I did that, because and I do remember taking my first English class that semester, and my professor told me that he was really glad that I was an English major.
Oh,
And
cool.
I felt like that was pretty good validation that I was on the right path. Um,
That's awesome.
and then that summer, I decided I really didn't want to go back to my hometown. And I decided to do some Bible camps, to be on a team, and we traveled to different towns in North Dakota, and we basically led Bible camps for children, for I think like 8 weeks out of the summer. Um, and that was a really difficult time for me, and I still think about that time a lot, because I think I was more confident in what I believed, in terms of whether I wanted to be Catholic or whether I wanted to, step away from that and try the more evangelical path.
Mm-hmm.
I was more, but at the same time, I think I was just very confused about my future. And another very significant thing that happened that summer, when I had a break from these camps, I went home for 2 weeks. And during that time, my mom got diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer.
Oh no.
Um, and I think I was so um, out of touch with my emotions at that point in my life, because I just felt like it was a bigger thing to, pursue God than to be in touch with what I was feeling. Um, and there were highlights of that summer, but there were definitely points where, especially after my mom's cancer diagnosis, I had to return to the camps for 2 more weeks. And I just remember one day we had like an hour of private prayer time, and I was up in the balcony at one of the churches and just making a list in my notebook of all the reasons why I thought that maybe God was calling me to be a nun. And I just wrote down reasons like I'm not good with people, I'm not good at talking to people, and I don't really enjoy life. Just those kind of things that you would think would be kind of a bigger indication that I needed to pay some attention to my mental well-being.
Yeah, but you weren't aware of it.
It, and yeah, and I just remember feeling like I didn't know where I wanted to go from there, because I didn't want to go home and face my mom's cancer. I didn't want to continue with these camps.
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily want to go back to college. There was just this feeling like there was nowhere I wanted to go. And so that was just a pretty difficult time, I think, for me.
How did you get through that?
I think it was helpful to just kind of keep going. I don't know. I just kind of had to keep going with the camps, and I had to keep teaching the kids and playing with them during their recess time. And
it distracted you from kind of the more difficult things that you were having to deal with too.
Yeah. I didn't necessarily feel like I could get vulnerable with my teammates, because I think vulnerability was still just a huge struggle for me at that time.
Sure.
And I was kind of just relieved when it ended. And when I went back home, I had thought that I would be, just like full of the joy of Christ or something after this, but instead I just felt depleted. I felt like everywhere I looked, there was sin. I felt like there was I just felt very critical of everybody, I think. Instead of feeling, a sense of gratitude or joy or anything positive. Then I ended up going on another retreat because my church at college asked me to be a peer minister. So I had to go to a training somewhere else, and this was a more evangelical type of Catholicism.
Okay.
So I kind of thought, oh, this is great. This is kind of like my two worlds combining, because we've got like the evangelical and the Catholic.
Yeah.
So, and that was where I met somebody, this guy who I really liked a lot, and I felt like he was somebody I was so-called equally yoked with.
Yeah.
But he was discerning the priesthood.
Oh, okay.
So I guess I kind of got back onto that boat of thinking maybe I need to continue discerning a possible religious vocation. It was just something that affected me mentally a lot, where it just kind of became like this intrusive thought. Like, I just felt like even if I wasn't called to it, it was just elevated in my mind as something that was just so radical and important that how could it compete, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, like it's such an important vocation to serve God. Like, how could
Right.
anything else compare to it?
Right. Even if I did have this writing vocation, um, or, just a writing career, whether you want to frame it as a vocation or not, like how could it be as important or, um, and so instead of thinking about, the possibility of losing my mom when she had cancer,
Mm-hmm.
I think my mind was still just so distracted and filled with this sense of needing to be who God wanted me to be and just kind of trying to figure out what that meant.
Mm-hmm. So that's where your focus was, and
My mom actually ended up passing away from cancer my sophomore year of college, over my spring break. Obviously that was a difficult thing, but I think even the emotional part of the whole grief just took a really long time to catch up with me.
I bet.
I think it was it was one of those things where, I think there's always that question of why and trying to figure out why did this happen, and I tried to figure it out from the context of my faith, and I just thought, what if God gave her cancer? What if she's died because she was kind of like this barrier that was keeping me from, pursuing this vocation as a nun because she was not in support of that.
Oh, wow.
And I remember sitting at her funeral and thinking about that and wondering if that was why this was happening.
Wow. That is
So,
intense. That's so horrible to have to deal with that thought and
yeah,
process what's happening.
yeah, it was pretty heavy. And I think I was scared to talk about it with anybody because it was like I didn't want to be called, but I felt bad for not wanting to be called, and I also felt like I was seeing these so-called signs different places. um I felt like it was just somewhere on my mind a lot.
Yeah.
And it took a while for that to kind of go away and subside, and for me to be more confident that it was good that I was an English major, that my classes started to um, feel more like um, the type of classes I wanted to be in, and that it was okay to want to be married. I think there was that feeling like I should desire God above a spouse. And but I just felt, especially after losing my mom, I just wanted that tangible relationship with a man so bad.
Yeah.
That and I just really it took a while, but I did come to that place of realizing I need to be in a relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
As many of us do to one degree or
right.
another,
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm really sorry to hear that she passed, and that
Yeah. Thank.
that I cannot imagine having to cope with that, and especially with the religious stuff that's in your head at that time in your life, trying to make sense of it. Yeah, that's, like you said, really heavy
Yeah.
and confusing.
Yeah. And two, I think that I guess I kind of felt that as long as I have my faith, this shouldn't be as hard for me as it would be for somebody who maybe doesn't have faith. Um, it took a while for me to realize that it doesn't matter what you believe. A loss is always going to be incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
And that, it's almost more concerning if you're not feeling anything about it. And
Yeah.
I definitely developed this kind of emotional numbness, and it took a while for me to break through that and actually, I did go to grief therapy eventually and really worked through a lot of things that I didn't realize I had to work through.
Yeah.
So,
Do you attribute the therapy or your mom's passing, do you attribute either of those things to bringing you out of a more religious mindset? Because prior to this, yeah.
And I wouldn't say that it's because it wasn't so much like, oh, I felt like it was unfair that my prayers weren't answered. I think even when I was religious, I was realistic in the sense that I didn't think that she would survive it. Or I knew that it was I think I was realistic in that I knew that she maybe wouldn't survive it, that she maybe would die. But there's a lot that happened that kind of got me to exploring answers outside of the context of my faith, to try to not only help myself in the grieving process, but also just making sense of the world as a whole.
For people who are listening, I think it's very common for people who've deconverted to have grief for one reason or another, whether it's just the process of losing their religion, or if they have a death in the family, or their life doesn't pan out the way they thought it would. You had to work through your grief. And you had to do it you learned how to do it without a religious framework. You learned how to do that without relying on religion to help you through it. What would you, maybe for those people who are listening who are having to do that too, like, what would you say helped you the most, as far as what did you learn in that process that you think was really key, was really helpful?
The process of grieving for my mom, or for
just you had to process anything. I mean, whether it be your mom or I guess that was mainly what you were processing, was the grief of losing your mom. But you said you had to do it without, you learned how to do it without, like, depending on God to make you feel better, right?
I guess I worked through a lot of the grief while I was still technically practicing Catholicism.
Okay.
But I felt like I was definitely not as extreme as I had gotten in college. I definitely, I think the last half of my college career, like my junior and senior year, I think I got to be a lot more stable with my friendships. I think one good thing that came out of the loss of my mom is that I got to be closer to some of my siblings. I think that we were all, this was a deep thing we were all going through. So I feel like that kind of opened the door for some deeper conversations.
Yeah.
And I got to have a better relationship with my dad. He'd always been a bit more distant, and I think we kind of worked through some things. And my college roommate, my senior year, had lost her dad, and so that was a really significant friendship for me, because we could safely confide in each other about these things that our other friends maybe didn't understand about what we were going through.
Yeah.
So I feel like overall, just learning to talk, was such a big thing for me. And being that was such a hard thing for so many years of my life, I think, going to therapy really challenged me to vocalize some of these things that I hadn't talked about to anybody before.
That's a huge accomplishment for you, having come from where you came from with that virus and with the disability that you had.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, what, now that you're not a practicing Catholic, I mean, was it at this time that you kind of decided to walk away from Catholicism, or was there, maybe tell me about that time when you decided that you'd walk away from being Catholic and you didn't want to be Catholic anymore.
So I think it happened after college. I moved back home. I moved back in with my dad back to my hometown. And I think that was a time where I was just kind of back to square one, where I felt like I was just alone a lot again. Um, I'd had I developed like, really strong friendships in college. I had a roommate who was my best friend who I talked to every day. And then all of a sudden it was like I was alone again. And I really started to just think more about what it was that I believed. Um, and to be back kind of in this Catholic bubble where going to church in that context again, where it was there, some of the sermons just really got to me. Um, I remember there was like a missionary priest who came one weekend and he was talking about, like if you kind of, again, like I said, that whole idea that if you don't go to church, then you'll go to hell. And he just, I think the way he said it was just kind of nonchalant.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just sitting there thinking about, like some of my best friends and some of my siblings who didn't go to church.
Yeah.
And for the first, I was just sitting there thinking, that can't possibly be true. Like, it just didn't make sense to me anymore. Just thought, if I'm going to believe in a higher power, I would want to believe in a higher power who is more understanding than that.
Yeah, yeah.
And so there were just a series of different aha moments, I think, for maybe a 3-year span of time. And I ended up developing depression and anxiety. And it was confusing because for a while I had attributed those to grief over the loss of my mom, because those are side effects of grief. But then it kind of showed up in such a way where I felt like it wasn't attributed to my mom. It was more just kind of a chemical imbalance that I couldn't explain. And so I ended up getting treatment for that, finally getting on a medication. I'd never been medicated before, only for a brief time. But I realized I really did need to get on an antidepressant to help me out this time. And for the first time, I really didn't know why I was in therapy. That was part of the reason why I was there. I just felt like I needed to figure out what it was that was making me so depressed and anxious. And it took some time before I realized that a lot of it kind of came from the belief system, because I was struggling with perfectionism and black and white thinking and all these symptoms that, if you look up symptoms of religious
trauma syndrome.
Trauma syndrome. Yeah, when I read the symptoms of those, I just thought, wow, that sounds a lot like me. And I didn't even hear about religious trauma syndrome until after I completed therapy. But my beliefs did come up in some discussions at therapy, and my therapist didn't disclose what it was that she believed, really. But she just kind of listened as I was talking, and I started to realize, I just feel like this isn't helping me. This isn't, I felt like I reflected on a lot of things that had happened to me and within my religion, and how that had affected the way I thought about things. And I felt like it didn't reflect my reality. It was a difficult thing to kind of slowly realize. I don't or I do support gay marriage, to realize, okay, that's something that I can accept. That was something that it took me a while to accept. And I realized I'm pro-choice. And that was a hard thing to realize that, I could be in favor of that,
Yeah.
and a lot of these questions kind of came up with the Trump election too, as I did more research on the candidates and trying to figure out what my stance was on certain things. So, yeah, and the more I kind of thought about it, the more I realized it just kind of felt like my relationship with Catholicism was kind of like a relationship that went sour.
Yeah.
Where I felt like there was not equal give and take. Like I felt like I was giving a lot of myself and it wasn't where God was meeting me.
Wow.
So
yeah, it's like it ceased having value for your life. It ceased being something that made sense for you to be Catholic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it had never really occurred to me that I could leave for a long time. I felt like I needed it to maintain a good relationship with one of my sisters who's more religious and her family. And I think I officially stopped going to church less than a year ago. I still continued weekly mass attendance, even when I moved away from my hometown and got a job somewhere else. And I think what really did it, I had never dated until I was 25. And I think part of that was because I felt that it didn't make sense to date in high school if you weren't ready to get married.
Yeah.
That was kind of maybe just what was communicated to me in my religion classes. Not that my classmates followed that, but for some reason I latched onto that.
Seriously, yeah.
And
that's kind of how my wife and I viewed it. Like it was like, well, we're not going to date unless we're going to get married. You know what I mean? Like
right. Yeah.
It's kind of it is a Christian idea to think of it that way.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I felt like I didn't really know what I was doing in that context. I didn't really know what I was looking for. It was hard for me to imagine myself with a Catholic at this point because I felt like my beliefs were wavering back and forth so much that I could see how maybe that would be frustrating for a more devout Catholic who was like, very sure about what he believed. So I just kind of got into online dating and decided I would just keep an open mind and see what I could find. And over time, I realized that I wanted to find somebody not according to what they believed, but according to their positive attributes and
nice.
how they treated me.
Which makes far more sense to be thinking of it in those terms. Yeah.
Right.
Because that's real life.
I had liked a guy for a very long time who was a very devoted Catholic. And it's like I was so focused on that idea that he was a devoted Catholic that I didn't even notice how much he wasn't paying attention to me.
Wow.
And it's like I just thought, well, if he's devoted and I'm devoted, it should just work. He should just be attracted to me the way I'm attracted to him. And and I realized it didn't work that way. Yeah, it was really heartbreaking. And I felt like a fool kind of to realize that. That you had
missed this really important piece of a relationship in that he wasn't really focused on you. You were just excited maybe that you guys were both Catholic and that it would just work out because you're Catholic.
Right. Yeah. So.
Yeah, it made me think of, I think it's the subtitle of Christopher Hitchens' book. I think his book title obviously is, or the one book that I'm thinking of is God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. And it's that subtitle that I just thought of when you were talking, because I just think rather than going into a relationship now the way you think, where you're like, okay, well, how's this person treat me? What are their positive attributes? Instead of focusing on that, religion has you also focusing on this religious piece that muddies the water, and it makes it hard to really have clarity, and it makes it hard to be in touch with reality in a sense, because you're not focusing on what's really happening in that relationship.
Right,
You're more focused on this idealism, of what the relationship could be or should be,
Yeah, that's such a good way of putting it. It just, yeah, it muddies the waters. It gets you focused on the wrong things and not highlighting the things that should be important. And I felt that way, with my vocation, with careers, and, my whole life purpose, and with dating, where, it just that whole idea of you needing to put God first just really screwed things up for me. And mentally too, putting, just kind of putting my own mental health on the back burner too. So,
what do you like best about being the person you are now compared to the very Catholic version of yourself?
I feel like I worry less about being perfect. I think I'm more open-minded and more willing to understand where people are coming from. And I like that I don't feel like I have to censor the information I'm consuming.
That's great.
I can, I've loved, listening to these podcasts and listening to other stories about why they've left. And
Yeah.
I guess I used to feel like I shouldn't be looking into things like that.
Yeah, you're filtering it as they're talking, like, well, they probably left the faith because something bad happened to them, and they really are, they shouldn't feel that way. Or, like, you're trying to filter it as a Christian. I may not be putting it that well, but yeah. But I know what you mean, like you're constantly having to be on guard and try to filter things the Christian way. Yeah. Well, what's something now in your life that I know it's only been a short time that you've stopped going to church, but what's something that you think you've learned or experienced since then that you would not have learned or experienced if you had stayed Christian?
I have a boyfriend now who is not Catholic.
There you go.
He had left when, he was raised Catholic as well, but never got near as deep into it as I did, so it wasn't as, big of a deal for him when he stopped going to church.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to think that a few years back, I probably wouldn't have considered a relationship with him just for that one reason that he wasn't practicing.
Yeah.
But I feel like he's so much better for me than I think a Catholic guy would have been.
That's cool.
Yeah, I think he just has all these attributes that I was told a guy couldn't have if he wasn't following Jesus, which I think that was one of the things too that just really kind of broke it off for me, to just, look at him and to realize this is ridiculous, to think that you're not saved or something like that. It's just, I don't know, bizarre to me now.
Yeah, it counters the narrative of the church that the church has the corner on morality, and that if you're marrying someone who's Christian or Catholic, that they are going to have a higher moral calling or a higher moral lifestyle or something.
Yeah.
Where what you're finding in real life is, at least for you, it's the opposite. Like, you're finding that you're having a better experience with a non-Catholic than you would with a Catholic. And I'm not saying this is true across the board, but what I'm saying is, in your experience, it's not what the church taught you all those years, that, if you were to go for a Catholic boy, he would be the better option of the two. You're finding that's not true for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I like that, because it flips the narrative on its head. It kind of, it shows that it's not true. It's not true for all people.
Yeah. I kind of learned to realize that a person's moral nature really doesn't have to do with what they believe so much as I don't know what it has to do with, just who they
Yeah.
are, and a lot of different factors.
Yeah, exactly. Well, now that you mentioned a couple of things that you were now you are for gay marriage, now you are pro-choice. That's a very different person, and you're not Catholic. That's a very different person from the person you used to be, who was very devout and went to church every Sunday and wanted to be a nun. So those are two totally different people in some ways. But
Yeah.
when you look back at your life, there's always something I think that we can say, even though I've changed a lot, there's something positive about myself that was always true when you were really Catholic, and even today, something that carried through that big change in your life. What's that? What's something for you that you would say carried through and is still true for you or true about you? Something positive about yourself.
I think I've always been a pretty patient person, and um, I I feel the way with, whether I'm, well, yeah. Um, I guess I feel that way about people. Um, I'm always curious about people's stories, and I feel like that hasn't really changed, and I feel like I've always kind of asked myself, what is the backstory here? Um, and I think that came from being marginalized when I had selective mutism and realizing some people don't understand why they are the way they are, and we can't just assume that we understand from an outsider's perspective.
It sounds like empathy,
Yeah, yeah. So I feel
patience,
like
and empathy.
yeah,
That's awesome. I think that's a really wonderful perspective to have about people. Just the what you've just described. I think that's
yeah.
great. um, so, as you know, there are people listening right now who have just deconverted from Christianity, and they might be struggling. They might have issues with mental health they're battling with. For someone like that who's just coming through it, um, what encouragement would you give them, or what guidance would you give them?
Well, they're not alone, and so many people who have gone through this before and are continuing to go through this, and there's lots of resources available on the internet, podcasts, articles, support groups, um, and all those things can kind of help make it better,
Mm-hmm.
and to just yeah, keep an open mind as you're listening to other people's stories. And I feel like any podcast I listen to, I always come away with at least one or two things that I never thought about before that make me feel better about my choice to leave.
Yeah,
So,
that's great. I'll just throw in that there's a podcast. Actually, it's based in Minnesota. You may have heard of it. It's called The Hilarious World of Depression.
oh, I didn't know that was based in
It's
Minnesota.
based. The guy is like, well, he's from my part of the country in the Northwest. Like, he's not from Seattle, but Seattle Tacoma sort of area, and he lives in St. Paul, Minneapolis now. And John Moe is his name, and he interviews comedians. That's kind of where they get the title for the show, but he interviews comedians about depression. And if you're listening to this podcast, you like to hear people's stories, and so I mention it because I think not just for listeners, but for you, like if you're interested in that kind of thing. I love it because they're shorter stories. They're not long.
Yeah.
But it's great because comedians just have a great perspective on life. And
Yeah, I agree. I
yeah,
think
and
I
it's
just
fun.
listened to
So
at least one of them. So,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, so it's cool. So yeah, that's something I've really appreciated lately is that's a podcast that I like to listen to.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything we haven't touched on that you wanted to share?
I think we covered a lot of ground here. I wasn't sure which directions it was going to go because I feel like it's something that I could talk about for a long time about just some of the weird things I was taught growing
Yeah.
up, how it's affected just a lot of different areas. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, you had such a unique experience, not just with your disability as a child, but, losing a parent, being really devout and wanting to be a nun. The Catholic perspective is not one that I get a lot on this show, so it's really nice to have that.
Yeah. And I had
mhm.
noticed that too, because I was sort of looking for, similar experience to mine. But
Yeah.
I love hearing the evangelical perspective too, because I think it's really sometimes when I hear just the commonality of, I was even recently reading the book Troublemaker by Leah, is it Ramini? Who she was in the show The King of Queens.
Okay.
But she was in Scientology, and she
yeah.
writes about her breakaway from that religion, and that's totally different. But yeah, she deconverted from Scientology, and it's just kind of the same idea of believing that one religion is the right religion and then realizing that you're wrong about that. And yeah, I realized I related a lot to her experience, even though it wasn't a deconversion from Christianity. So
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting to realize that sometimes you have these things in common, even if it's not the exact same religion.
Yeah, exactly. Well, for any Catholics listening and for yourself, I don't know if you found them, but I think episode 5 was with my friend Maria Stottmuller. She was Catholic. Marty McDonald is another friend of mine.
I listened to that one. Yeah, that was a good one.
Yeah. There's a few there was a guy from Mexico who was a Catholic.
Okay.
So there's been a few, but I tend to, I think, have a lot of guests on who were very involved in like the charismatic movement.
Right.
I think it was my experience, so I think those people find it.
Yeah.
Find the podcast, Well, before we, say goodbye, I want to thank you for being willing to share your experience. I found it just really inspiring, and you've come through so much, and it's really neat to see how you processed everything and came through it all. So, I'm grateful that you shared your story today.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really good to be able to talk about it for a while with, a greater group of people, and I hope someone out there can find it useful. So.
Thanks for listening to Voices of Deconversion. Be sure to join us next time by subscribing to the podcast.